Well, good evening once again from our NBC News headquarters here in New York, day 1020 of the Trump administration. And we are obviously watching tonight's election results, including the big upset for the Democrats in Mitch McConnell's home state, the race Donald Trump campaigned for just last night in Kentucky. Our report on the late results in just a moment. The day's other big headline is a striking reversal of testimony from an important impeachment witness. Let us first tell the story through tonight's headlines. New York Times, Sondland updates impeachment testimony describing Ukraine quid pro quo. There's that phrase again. And the Washington Post, it's early yet, Sondland adds to testimony linking aid to Ukraine probes sought by Trump. Gordon Sondland raised a lot of money for Donald Trump and was richly rewarded with the job title U.S. Ambassador to the European Union. That made him a big witness on Ukraine. And today he remembered the story differently from the last time he testified before so many other witnesses came forward to tell the story the other way. There's been a 3-page update issued to amend his initial closed-door testimony to those House investigators last month. He originally told lawmakers he didn't know if military aid for Ukraine was linked to the president's desire for investigations into the Bidens. In today's updated testimony, Sondland says discussions described by other witnesses have, quote, refreshed my recollection about conversations involving the suspension of U.S. aid. Calls that on September 1st, he told a top aide to President Zelensky in Ukraine that, quote, resumption of U.S. aid would likely not occur until Ukraine provided the public anti-corruption statement that we have been discussing for many weeks. And this, the ambassador becomes the fourth witness to affirm an effort to hold up that aid from Ukraine in their fight with the Russians, remember, in exchange for political damage to the Bidens. House Democrats also released Sondland's full testimony from just last month, in which he said the president repeatedly ordered him to, quote, talk to Rudy Giuliani last May, saying Ukraine is a problem. He described dealings with Ukraine as an escalating set of demands, which became conditions for American support, adding those demands, quote, kept getting more insidious as the timeline went on. Sondland testified after reading what was happening. He believed the demands on Ukraine were improper, if not illegal. He said he's not a lawyer. House Democrats also released closed-door testimony from this guy, Kurt Volker, the former special envoy to Ukraine. He has since resigned. He said at the time he didn't know why aid was being blocked and that, quote, the negative narrative about Ukraine, which Mr. Giuliani was furthering, was the problem. It was, in my view, it was impeding our ability to build the relationship. And he added, interestingly, hanging over everyone's head in the expert community is there some grand bargain with Russia where we throw Ukraine under the bus? Here was the reaction from the White House press secretary.
The transcripts that were released today show exactly what the president has been saying all along, and that is that he did nothing wrong and that there was no quid pro quo. So these transcripts are actually, they're good for the president. They're showing again that this entire time he's been telling the truth.
On Capitol Hill, Republicans seem to be honing their strategy to attack the impeachment inquiry. There are now discussions underway to replace Ohio Congressman Jim Jordan, a Trump defender at all costs, on the Intelligence Committee ahead of public televised hearings. But today, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell tried to toss cold water on the whole thing with this prediction.
If it were today, I don't think there's any question it would not lead to a removal. I'd be surprised if it didn't end the way the two previous ones did, with the president not being removed from office.
NBC News reporting that a source says Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman will testify publicly in the impeachment inquiry if asked. The source says he's not yet been approached, but that Vindman is expected back on the Hill Thursday to review the testimony of his own the transcript of his own testimony. We're also learning that David Hale, one of the State Department's most senior diplomats, is expected to testify on his own on Wednesday. Jennifer Williams, special advisor to the vice president for Europe and Russia, is expected to testify Thursday. House Democrats were aiming even higher today. They summoned White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney to testify. You may recall it was Mulvaney who confirmed a quid pro quo on Ukraine out loud, right there on camera, before he took it back later. The White House is blocking him from showing up. So far this week, half a dozen Trump administration officials asked to give their testimony in the impeachment inquiry have been no-shows on the Hill. On that, time to bring in our lead-off discussion group on a Tuesday night. Philip Rucker, Pulitzer Prize-winning White House bureau chief for The Washington Post, here with us in the studio. Robert Costa, national political reporter for The Washington Post and moderator of Washington Week on PBS. And veteran federal prosecutor, former U.S. attorney, Barbara McQuade. Good evening and welcome to you all. My apologies to our two friends from The Washington Post for instead making you employees of The New York Post, however briefly. Mr. Costa, you have, I note on social media tonight, been making the rounds of the various profiles in Courage, otherwise known as members of the U.S. Senate, with tonight's election results in mind. Start with our lead story and tell us what you've learned.
A significant day here on Capitol Hill. I spent the whole day at the Capitol, walking around the Senate, talking to Senate Republicans. Just got off the phone with Scott Reed, the chief strategist for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, one of the most influential financial groups for the Republican Party in the country. Real alarm in the Republican Party tonight about losing a red state. Yes, Governor Bevin, the incumbent, was unpopular. Everyone acknowledges that. But the president rallied for him on Monday. And this is a tense time for the Republican Party. So many senators today, nearly a dozen, did not want to go on the record, but talked about their unease about the outlook for 2020 and the president's political capital.
Phil Rucker, always magnanimous. The Trump campaign has put out a statement tonight that I'm just now reading. The president just about dragged Governor Matt Bevin across the finish line. The president did say in front of the crowd last night in Kentucky, if you lose, it sends a really bad message. You can't let that happen to me. Do you think the president will take this personally?
He will take it personally, but he's not going to accept any blame personally. And I assume when he speaks about this tomorrow, he'll echo that statement from the campaign. But we should underscore what a significant loss this is politically for the president. Kentucky is not one of those swing states. It's a state that he won handily in 2016 that he's expected to carry with a significant margin in 2020. He flew there last night because he thought he could get Bevin over the finish line. That was a rally to get out the vote, to turn out all those Trump supporters to vote for the Republican incumbent governor, and it was not enough. And so that's an indication that Trump supporters are not necessarily going to follow his lead there and vote for his candidate. That being said, the McConnell-aligned Republican nominee for Attorney General did prevail down ballot in that state, and Bevin, as Bob was just saying, is uniquely unpopular there. But it is still a political defeat for the president.
Hey, Bob, did we get it about right at the top of the broadcast that the Republicans' latest reaction to Sondland and impeachment is kind of morphing day by day into, if it did happen, it's not impeachable still?
It's not even there, Brian. Let me put it this way. When I bring up the impeachment inquiry and all the substance of the facts, so many Republican senators do not want to engage on the substance. Instead, they want to talk about the upcoming IG report from Attorney General Barr, the Attorney General's own report on the Russia probe. That's where they are right now in the Republican Party, trying to build a counter narrative rather than dealing with the own narrative in front of their face.
Barb, when you hear about a high-profile witness revising their testimony after refreshing their memory, does it bring back fond memories of being a Fed?
It does, although I'll tell you, he waited an awfully long time to revise his statement. One of the things that typically happens when you have a witness in the grand jury is you give them an opportunity to recant. You give them a warning and tell them if there's anything they said that was false, this is their opportunity to change their testimony and correct it. And sometimes they do on the spot. For him to delay a number of weeks between the time he gave that statement and the time he changed it because his recollection has been refreshed by the testimony of others, I think strains credulity a little bit. He suggests that he forgot and didn't remember that he had this conversation with an aide to President Zelensky about withholding almost $400 million in military aid in exchange for these investigations that President Trump wanted, it just doesn't strike me as the kind of thing that slips one's mind.
Phil Rucker, part of the problem with the Republican argument that this is a kind of deep state pact is that it would have had to have been a pact from all these big names, including career public servants, including members of the military, with no motivation or reason to lie. They all seem to be telling pieces of the same story.
That's right, Brian. And what's so significant, I think, today about the testimony of Ambassador Sondland is he's not one of these career patriots. He's not somebody that Trump can say was from the deep state or a never Trumper, to use the president's phrase. But he's a political appointee. He gave a ton of money to the Trump campaign in 2016. He's been supporting the president. He wanted a job in the administration, and he was rewarded with this ambassadorship. And in his testimony, his initial testimony a week or two ago, he actually spoke in a way that helped the president. He was defending the president's integrity and motivations and so forth. And for him to make this correction, to point out the quid pro quo, to acknowledge the quid pro quo that the president and his aides have been denying all this time is really extraordinary because of his political identity and his appointee status.
And while I have you, let's talk about Mike Pompeo for a hot second. It had been said that he had shifted his ambition to go run back home in Kansas for political office. His name, however, just keeps coming up in this case. It would certainly indicate he gave Rudolph Giuliani's involvement in foreign policy at least his tacit approval. People were trolling him on social media today by repeating the honor code at West Point. Things have turned dark for the Secretary of State.
They have. Mike Pompeo is relatively young in politics. He was a congressman from Kansas, and he aspires to great things. He wants to maybe someday run for president. So this being Secretary of State in the Trump administration is not the last stop in Pompeo's tour of public service, and he's been eyeing that Senate seat in Kansas. But he decided over the summer not to leave the administration and run for Senate, but to continue on as the Secretary of State. And, you know, talking over the last few weeks to some of his confidants, there's concern that that could really damage him politically in the future because he is so entwined now in this Ukraine scandal. His name keeps coming up. It's his own advisors and subordinates who are testifying, who are a part of this. And he, as you just noted, allowed for Rudy Giuliani, the president's personal attorney, to be so integral in the shaping of American foreign policy.
And Robert Costa, that's part of the cost of this. The dynamic you just spoke of, distractions, looking down other holes for an argument, for evidence. The names can pile up. People with established careers, or so they thought, who have been caught up tangentially in this and keep getting mentioned by this list of credible witnesses who are coming forward.
I remember being in Poland with Vice President Pence while he's sitting there with President Zelensky of Ukraine, and he's delivering this message about corruption to the Ukrainian president. Even the vice president, the Secretary of State, find themselves entangled in this controversy, this impeachment inquiry at different levels. And the answer to all this is so many people who succeed in President Trump's inner circle, they accept the culture, the transactional nature, the way of accepting his behavior and conduct. But once you do that, some things fester on the side. Like Rudy Giuliani's rogue foreign policy conduct. And because of that acceptance and that culture, so many people like the Secretary of State and the Vice President find themselves facing really tough questions about what they knew and what they did.
Barb, remember the Republican flash mob in the hearing room where these depositions were being taken behind closed doors. They demanded the proceedings be opened, even though they were part of the proceedings all the while. They demanded transparency. This is what transparency looks like. Now we're able to read the testimony gathered behind those closed doors all the while. Do you think in a weird reverse kind of way, this has made a case for closed door depositions and orderly process in the gathering of facts?
I think it has worked really quite well. You know, one of the disadvantages that the House had in this inquiry, different from what we've seen in the past, is the absence of a special counsel or an independent counsel to do the early legwork. And so the first step that has to be taken is the initial interviews, which can take 8 or 10 hours, as we saw, and then putting just the highlights before the American people in a hearing room really is an efficient way to go about it. It also forces people into what's known as the prisoner's dilemma. When witnesses don't know what the other witnesses are saying, they have a hard time keeping their story straight. And I think that is the situation that Gordon Sondland found himself in. He didn't know whether everybody else was going to stay on the same page of music or tell the truth. And once he realized that the other people were telling the truth, he had to scurry and do the same. And so I think it has been kind of a lesson in an effective way to conduct these kinds of investigations.
Greatly appreciate our big three rolling with us through some breaking news tonight and starting us off in fashion. Philip Rucker, Robert Costa, Barbara McQuaid. Thank you all.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.